and welcome everyone. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. Um, this is a challenging time, I think, for people, even if it's a good day or a bad day. We've had a good week and an okay week, or sometimes um, a terrible week. But the underlying situation seems to be one of, for me, as I mentioned earlier, is quite anxiety ridden. Now, that's whether I notice it or not. If I have a good day, I might not notice it. And I kind of move beyond and do my thing. If I have a bad day, then that anxiety makes it sort of a big flashpoint, of things. And one of the ways that I cover up my fear, if you could equate anxiety and fear, they are neurologically slightly different. One is a psychological experience, the other is kind of a very physical experience. So they go together in some ways. But both anxiety and fear are very important um, aspects of our human experience. If we didn't have that, human beings would have become food a long time ago for some uh, being higher up on the food chain at that point. We managed to evolve in such a way to give ourselves sort of predominance in the ecosystem, in the planet altogether. One might say maybe too much dominance. Certainly, it is kind of at a critical mass tipping point as to how many people now we have and how much we're impacting the environment. So that becomes something that we have to wake up to. And I think the proliferation of the species now creates a different kind of anxiety. So it's interesting that anxiety allowed us to climb the ladder because we were always fearful about who could take us over, who could attack us, perhaps who could eat us. And in so doing, we developed either consciously or even just in terms of our evolution, ways to defend ourselves, ways to outsmart and out strategize predators. And this kind of gave rise to this great big brain that we have, comparatively speaking, this huge, brain that we have. And interestingly enough, I mean, we think of the brain as a beautiful, wonderful thing, perhaps. Maybe we don't always, but, it is certainly. And it's powerful. And, you immediately think of Shakespeare or Tool or any of the great arts or, Picasso or any of the ways that human beings have created these expressions of their culture, which is vast and wonderful. But those cerebral cortexes really developed also as a way to out strategize and outmaneuver danger. So when we get frightened and triggered, which happens in the lower brain, brainstem, and even the hippocampus become primarily affected. We become anxious in the body. We become slightly depressed in the emotions. And what begins to happen is then our higher cortexes, instead of writing poetry and painting expressionistic paintings, are actually truncated down to maneuvers of survival. And that's what happens to many of us. We get frightened, and because we're frightened, everything shrinks and condenses. The body gets tight, the mind gets smaller and focused, and we get into this survival mode. It might happen subtly and so quickly that we don't think that we're in survival mode necessarily, but we're all of a sudden trigger angry about something, or we're all of a sudden really kind of lashing out about something. Other possibilities to escape the uncomfortableness of anxiety and fear, aside from a big brain that starts thinking and strategizing, because that's our primary protective weapon. We start thinking through it and think about it. If you get triggered, and maybe you noticed it as fear, maybe you didn't, but in any case, maybe you just got upset about something. And then you go home and ruminate about it. You can't sleep at night, perhaps, because you're thinking about what you could have said or how you should have handled the situation. That those situations actually spin around and around in the mind. And that is the mind's way of trying to best the situation, trying to control something out of its control, because the mind doesn't like to think something is out of its control. But here it was completely offended by somebody. And instead of just accepting that and going, well, I'm bigger than this, and letting it go, or breathing it in and breathing it out, which is our ideal kind of response rather than reaction, what tends to happen is when we're fearful or anxious, we react very quickly because there's no space, because everything's so tense and tight. And when that happens, then we overengage the brain. And the brain starts thinking of scenarios and thinking of stories. And this is how we not only wound ourselves initially, but keep re-wounding ourselves. Walking down the street, thinking of what we could have said, how we should have dealt with the situation, how it could have happened differently. I think I've shared this before, but I was in a car with a friend of mine, and I actually didn't realize it was a long drive, and I didn't even realize that I had started talking to myself. And he turned to me and he said, "Are you arguing with somebody?" And I said, "Yes, I'm going through a conversation I had with my brother earlier in the day. I'm sorry." And he said, "Well, did it work out better this time?" And I was like, yeah, I guess it kind of did, because my brain will keep going over and over until it finds a satisfying conclusion. It has nothing to do with what already happened. What's actually happened is I've not only robbed myself of my present experience in my life, instead of looking out the windows and enjoying the company and the tribe, I was going over and over something that my brother had triggered me about, completely fruitless. But it's the brain's way of saying, this is how I'm working with it so that I can prove that I'm in control. I can try to work out the scenario so that finally I figure it out and I could let you go to sleep. I could relax. And that's how anxiety underneath drives the overactive brain. It's no direct correspondence cognitively, so we don't really realize maybe even that it's anxiety. What we tend to do is focus on the object of our ire. So I'm angry at my brother, and he's a very stubborn person. There's no question about it. Most of you would probably go through the same circumstance that I do with him. But that's just me talking. Maybe he feels the same way. And maybe objectively, many of you would find him delightful and charming. I doubt it, but still, it's possible. I'm joking. But because we're brothers, he can really get to me. He could say things that just really get me inside. And before I have a chance to think about it, or even think of it, is it this important or not, I'm already reacting like as if I'm fighting for my life. My brain is going into strategies of how I could talk him through this, or what I should do about it, or how we could work this out, right? And that kind of thing. And that's kind of how fear plays into our anger too, because the fear condenses everything when we feel fearful. And sometimes it condenses it so much so that we don't even notice that it's about fear and anxiety. And we're just focused on the thing, the object of our ire. We're just focused on this person that's upset us. And we become brilliant. When you're angry, you're maybe at your most lawyerly. I like to say people, when they're triggered and they're angry, they become great lawyers. All of a sudden you're in your brain going, well, last Thursday I said at 8 o'clock you could be ready to blah, blah, blah. And we figure everything out in absolute detail about how this person hurt us and how about we were put upon. And our brain is, again, trying to protect us. But it's trying to protect us in ways that are completely theoretical. The other person can't hear most of these arguments. And if they do, when we do lash out, it's usually not at the right size. It's either too much volume or too much apology to really communicate what we really feel, because we're so impacted. We can't actually communicate. See, it takes the heart to actually communicate. And I don't mean that in a Hallmark card way, that like, well, it means we have to cry and hug somebody. And we could just be talking about the weather. But if we're coming from our head and we're strategizing and we're being defensive, people feel that. Whatever it is, it feels off-putting, it feels uncomfortable. We've all worked with people like that. They're not trying to hurt us or, push us away, but there's something about their demeanor. It's so mentally oriented that it doesn't feel friendly. It doesn't feel like there's any way in. The way to really feel that you're letting people in is an openness of the heart center, literally, the center of the body, that our energy is not localized in the brain in its defensive operations, but down in the body in its nurturing, nurturing tendencies. So we actually, opening the heart allows us to feel a kind of nurturing for each other that people naturally then can listen to. They are more naturally inclined to want to connect to and want to respond with, They feel safe, in other words, in that situation. I teach public speaking. I do a lot of it myself. And one core part of public speaking is that people, the most common questions will center, and they're always the wrong questions in a way, around, I keep forgetting my script and I freeze up and I blank out. Well, this is all mental. That's all mental stuff. And that happens when people are in their head. And what I encourage people to do is be down in their body, to actually feel their feet on the floor when they're performing, when they're singing, when they're dancing, when they're public speaking. Anything where other people are going to be paying attention, we need to be grounded and then open in heart so that people actually have a way in to really feel the situation. If we're grounded, our feet on the floor, and our heart is open, then the words will be there. And if the right words, the words that we're trying to remember aren't there, new words will come because we'll have the space to be creative. This, even if we're frightened, because these are the tools that can circumvent the fear a little bit. 1, body, grounded. Feel yourself connected to the earth, to the ground, to your guitar, to your partner. Feel yourself connected to the earth. And then relax the body so that the heart can communicate a little bit, or so that you have a certain physical, somatic radiance that allows people to really trust you and feel you. This creates space. So even if you're frightened, we have space, and then the mind can begin to see clearly. It remembers what it needs to say, or if not, it can come up with things to say because it's really present. I've done a lot of improv acting, and I don't know if people have done that, but if you have, it's not as magical as it seems when you watch an improv group. You go, how do they come up with, how do they do that? But actually, there's real rules, there's guidelines, and there's ways to do this. And that's what they're doing. They're grounding it physically and then opening things up emotionally so that it becomes very easy for the mind to pay attention and to be present. The opposite of this is the aforementioned constriction that happens in the body with fear. The problem isn't the fear. Thank goodness for the fear. And the problem isn't the other person that's upset us. Thank goodness for people that upset us. The problem is that we become unmindful, that we're not paying attention. And when the fear comes, we constrict the body, which eliminates all the space. And then the energy that comes up and down between the body and the mind constantly, that's part of our process, gets constricted. And as you constrict any conduit, narrow the gauge, the pressure is greater. So the pressure from all the stimulus in the body, including any of the agita or anxiety or anything feeling in the body, comes up to the mind very intensely. The mind narrows its focus and just tries to extricate itself from the problem. I can't remember my lines. I can't remember my lines. And we start to panic. Same process if you lose your keys. And generally, if you lose your keys in the morning, it's usually when you're running late already. So instead of like going, What did I do with my keys? Let me remember. We tend to run around the house berating ourselves, angry at ourselves. That's another very common thing that we start doing when we feel panic. We have to fight something. And if there's no thing out there to fight, we'll fight ourselves. We'll get angry at ourselves and tense with ourselves and start bitching in our own brain. It's very kind of interesting, the process that we go through. The remedy, relax, stop, drop down into your body and open up into your experience. Feel your feet on the floor. Feel your heart open. I like to tell people stop, drop, open. And then you could add roll if you want to allude to the fireman thing. Stop, drop, open, and flow back into your experience. The problems come because we lack synchronicity with our life, and then we get threatened. Another way that fear, unregarded fear, when we're not mindful of it, constricts us, not just physically and puts the mind into this overdrive, but it also starts to shut down our world and our life. We lose sight of the goodness and richness in the world when we're frightened. And the other survival instinct besides thinking and thinking and thinking is acquiring and acquiring and acquiring. So we become like octopuses. This is my attempt to work in everything we talked about earlier, Charlie. And you know, octopuses have 8 legs, and they also are incredibly attracted to shiny, beautiful objects. That's the actual source of the Beatles song Octopus's Garden, because they had, Ringo Starr had read about this phenomenon. It's actually a true thing, that octopuses will be attracted by shiny things at the floor of the ocean and create these gardens. They'll actually arrange them. And some of that is to impress a mate, right? So that's very, very similar, right? Where our multifarious arms go out and we start clinging and grasping to things to increase our status in the world. Maybe it's more sophisticated than attracting a mate. Maybe it's getting a raise at work or being loved by people. But this idea that we're not enough and that we have to cling and grasp to all the shiny objects in life is a fear-based operation. We're trying to fill ourselves up with love so that someone will love us. And often that process does the very opposite, doesn't it? People who are very materialistic or very greedy or very intent on gathering things to themselves don't always find it very easy to connect to other people. We're so worried about losing what we have, we don't have space for another person. And so the very thing that we might really want, which is real love, real attention from another human being, gets completely thwarted because of our obsession to fill ourselves up. And that filling up can happen any number of ways. It can happen materially, but it can happen with food, as you know. It can happen with alcohol. Substances often for many people aren't about getting obliterated, knocked down drunk because I can't deal with life. That's the case for some people. But for some people, it's just, I need more and more. I need more and more so I can numb myself from the pain, right? Eating to the point when you can't feel the pain any longer. Loving from the point that you can't feel the pain any longer. The anxiety driving us to accumulate these shiny objects into our life that actually weight us down and frequently cut us off from the very thing we want, which is real heartfelt connection to the world. One thing that's coming into vogue a lot now, particularly in the substance kind of communities, I don't want to say substance abuse, but substance consciousness communities, you know, you might say, is the idea that the antidote, one of the primary antidotes to addiction is community, is connection. That addiction thrives on isolation, that we're actually either doing it purposefully to separate ourselves from other people that we are fearful of, again, fear-based, or we're so fear-based that we're becoming so addicted to something that it's driving other people away because it's not attractive, because it's creepy and it's weird. And we're all caught in our kind of sexual addiction or our physical addiction or our substance addiction. We can't see that the very thing we want, which is love and connection, and the very thing that can heal us, is being separated out. So addiction thrives on isolation. So what begins to happen is we become separated from the very antidote that we need, which is what we have here today, this community, this Hollywood Squares, Brady Bunch squares of people here, all looking at each other and connecting to each other. One of the times that is really difficult, and this will be the last topic heading, and now I've hit everything I think that we had talked about. The last one is Alejandro's suggestion of talking a little bit about the holidays, because this is the real time that people get fearful and get triggered in all of these ways. Their fear triggers anger very easily right now because of the holidays. Our fear triggers consumption and overconsumption and addiction a lot in the holidays. We want to fill things up and fill things up, and this is supposed to be a season of giving. And the idea of giving is that we feel enriched because we feel like we have the confidence and the quality and the richness to offer, to give. That makes us feel wonderful. But in most cases, we're sitting here worried about what we're going to give and don't think that we could give enough. And we want something in return for the gifts. And there's so much anxiety that gets thrown into the whole Christmas season for a lot of people, because it's not about the spirit of giving. It's about the materialism of it. It's about the guilt of not feeling like we have enough. Or in my case, the guilt of just being too lazy to get gifts off on time. You know, whatever it is, however we play the game. Very frequently, this time of year is supposed to be about feeling warmth and connection, and frequently makes people feel more lonely and disconnected. One of the reasons for that, which is probably important to note, is also why the holiday happened to be, you know, the winter period of the darkest day of the year, right? The solstice is the 21st typically, but a lot of cultures have holidays. And whether there was actually a fellow named Christ who was born on the 25th of December, or whether that became the date because that was the time when people celebrated the darkness of the real kind of deepening of the winter and the fear that people have around that. Winter represents death. Winter represents a dying away and a closing down. Winter makes it really clear when you haven't saved enough, when you haven't been the good grasshopper who saved whenever that child's thing was. And all of a sudden it comes to toll in the winter and you're like cold and you're alone. And most of us don't really suffer from that necessarily in this community, in this kind of community, but the fear is always there, right? The fear is always there in humans. It's been here since we've been human, that we don't have enough. And that dark days are really extra frightening. How do we react to that fear? By going into our head, by lashing out, or by pulling in. Three primary ways of escaping our fear and anxiety are passion, desire, aggression, hatred, or ignorance, just numbing ourselves out, filling up with food and forgetting all about it. These are the three things that in the Buddhist teachings, those three things are considered to be the three poisons, because they lead then to other harmful activities: passion, aggression, ignorance. The three kind of poisons, the three ways that we inappropriately respond to our anxiety and our fear. We either want too much, we either hate too much, or we just devour too much and shut ourselves down completely. So these are the ways that fear and anxiety kind of work in terms of the Buddhist concept mostly, but also I think there's just a fair bit of neurological understanding with that. The idea of how the mind and body have developed over the time to keep us alive and keep us safe, also keep us often in a lot of pain and suffering if we don't develop this magical gift called mindfulness, this ability to begin to pay attention. The antidote: feel the fear. Let go of the object just for a moment. Feel the fear and just be there with it until it changes, until it goes away, until we become comfortable with it. We could talk more